Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you very much for joining this webinar today. We would like to just quickly apologize because we will need to wait a couple of minutes, a few minutes to start the webinar. We will be a little bit late, but once again, thank you for being here. And in the meantime, I can just briefly explain. As you know, the webinar is on the topic of addressing late payments, insights, and strategies from non-EU perspectives. We will have some introductory remarks. We will have a presentation of the thematic report that we published on the same topic. And this will be followed by a panel discussion, which will also have a Q&A at the end. For the Q&A session, please, you can see at the bottom of your screen, I think, the Q&A button. You are free to ask questions through that button, and we will answer them during our panel discussion towards the end. That's it for now. So let's just thank you for your patience. So let's just wait a few minutes until the start of the webinar. For any participants just joining, please note we are a couple of minutes late. We will start the webinar very soon. Thank you for your patience. Also, please note that in the chat, you can we have shared the link to the thematic report that we will be presenting today. You can find the report there. Okay, I think we could start this webinar today. Once again, thank you for your patience and thank you for being here. We're glad to have you here and present the thematic report and have a very interesting panel discussion. So as mentioned, the topic of the webinar is addressing late payments, insights and strategies from non-EU perspectives. As you know, late payments are a pervasive issue that affect businesses and can hinder business development and innovation. They can create cash flow problems and also financial instability for many businesses. The thematic report that was just published that you can find on the link shared in the chat, the findings suggest that the negative effects of late payments are visible not only in the EU member states, but also in non-EU countries. We see once again that SMEs and also interestingly sectors with complex supply chains are particularly vulnerable. I see Antonella joined, so I will pass on the floor to you, Antonella. We just started a few seconds ago.
Yes, good morning, everyone. My apologies and apologies also from part of the team, but we're in a previous meeting talking about how invoicing can help monitoring about payment performance. So welcome everyone to this webinar. Thank you, Sose. I think already you've made some introductory statements. We have the opportunity to present this report, but we believe it's very topical. Just a few weeks ago, there was an interesting article on the Financial Times saying about the global impact of late payments. And I was very surprised and astonished to see that late payment is a problem that is denounced by more than 50% of economic operators worldwide. So this is a global problem. And so this is on the basis of that, we also decided to take a look how this is being tackled in other non-EU jurisdictions. We will present the main highlights of the report that has been produced within the observatory. And I would like to welcome our hosts today, Terry Corbin and Anthony Flynn, with whom we will, I promise you, we will have a very, very interesting discussion about the topic. So without further ado, I leave Sose to carry on through the results of this report. And thank you very much for being present today.
Thanks very much, Antonella. Just give me 1 second. I'll start sharing the screen. I think you can see it. So, okay, thank you for the confirmation. Just give me 1 second until I figure out some technicalities. Okay. So our thematic report is called Addressing Late Payments, Insights and Strategies from Non-EU Perspectives. And the agenda for today's webinar, just to quickly show, we had some introductory remarks. As mentioned, we will present the thematic report, and then we will have the very interesting panel discussion. So to talk a little bit about the thematic report as an introduction, we would like to explain what the objectives of this report are and also the material and geographic scope. In terms of the objectives, the goal of the report was to explore the prevalence of late payments and to examine the measures that are aimed at addressing them in selected non-EU countries. We also aimed to compare these dynamics with those within the EU to notice and to highlight any similarities and differences that would be there, and also to identify any good practices from outside the EU that could be useful. In terms of the material scope, we looked at measures adopted in the selected countries to combat late payments. This includes both legislative and non-legislative measures. We also looked at, wherever possible, qualitative and quantitative data to provide an overview of the situation in practice. And at common challenges, we try to identify any common challenges and or unique circumstances that the selected non-EU countries and the EU have. In terms of the geographic scope, we looked at 4 advanced economies outside the EU. This would be Australia, Canada, the US, and the UK. And in terms of the selection criteria, we chose countries that have strong trade relations with the EU, also that have a similar approach to measures addressing late payments in that they have a mix of legislative and non-legislative measures, and also a bit at the economic context, perhaps inflation rates and that sort of thing, those sort of criteria. In terms of the trade, it would be important to note that indeed EU has stronger relations in trade with all four of these countries. For instance, in 2023, the EU was Australia's third largest trading partner. It was also Canada's third largest trading partner. With the US, the EU have the largest bilateral trade and investment relationship, and US is actually EU's largest trade and investment partner. And with the UK, UK exports of goods and services to the EU reach approximately 420 billion euros, and that accounts for 41% of all UK exports. So there, as you can see, there is a strong trade relationship with all of those countries, and therefore we selected this to see what the situation with late payments is in these selected countries. Now let's dive into some information from each of them for all countries, and we can discuss a little bit the measures addressed in each of them and also what the situation in practice is in those countries. In terms of the measures adopted in Australia, we have the payment times reporting scheme. This scheme requires large businesses and some government enterprises to report on their payment terms and practices, and in this way it aims to increase transparency. In terms of legislation, there is also legislation in the building and construction sector. This ensures timely payment for construction work through a rapid adjudication process. It's called Building and Construction Industry Act. Through the rapid adjudication process, and this legislation was amended in 2023. The process is in the process, it allows a dispute over a payment claim that remains unpaid. It can be more quickly resolved through what is called an authorized nominating authority. So this allows, this can be particularly useful for small businesses and medium-sized enterprises in order to avoid costly judicial proceedings. In addition, we have the Australian Supplier Payment Code, which it is a voluntary code, but those who sign it commit to paying small business suppliers on time and within 30 days of receiving a correct invoice. And also it has some provisions that aim to help implement technologies for faster invoicing. The situation in practice in Australia, as you can see in the graph, the on-time payments have remained in the last 3 years between 60 to 70% approximately, with some variations. One thing we noticed based on the data in Australia is that the larger the company, the lower the timeliness of the payment. So as the company size grows, also decreases the prompt payments from the company. And in this slide, it is important to note that SMEs are paid late in SME invoices when they were invoicing large businesses. They were paid 53% of cases late. The annual cost of this is rather big. It is approximately 1.1 billion Australian dollars, equivalent of over 600 million euros for SMEs. One thing we notice is also that there is a domino effect on the supply chain payment. So once there is a late payment to the first subcontractor, then it continues down the supply chain. And businesses in Australia were reporting that they have increased the time, the cost, and resources that they spend on chasing invoices. Moving on to Canada, which is federal state with with states regulating in a bit more detail the issue of late payments. There is still federal legislation on federal construction contracts. It establishes prompt payment principles and also action plans for government agencies. It also is engaging with the industry to develop concrete action plans and recommendations to improve the timeliness of payments. One important thing to mention here is that this legislation has created a database in which the government discloses details about the payment for constructionally related contracts. So in this way, it aims to ensure transparency and accountability. As mentioned, there is also state legislation. One particular, they have quite a few across the different states in the country. And an interesting point to note is about government to business payment terms. Legislation in Canada, federal legislation mandates that government bodies and agencies have to make the payments within 30 days, and there are automatic interest payments for this purpose. So if the government does not pay on time the invoice, then automatically interest is deducted. In terms of the situation in practice, the average percentage of invoices that are paid late is 46%, with bad debt accounting for 6%, an additional 6% of late payments. Bad debt is usually referred to as in the cases when the money is not going to be paid eventually due either to the unwillingness of the payer or due to circumstances that the payer is unable to pay anymore. Once again, we see that the larger the company, the less timely the payments become, and micro and small businesses are the most prompt payers. Again, SMEs are paid late in 53% of invoices when they're dealing with large businesses. And once again, similar to Australia, we see a domino effect on the supply chain payments. Companies in Canada are reporting that they have difficulties in meeting financial obligations due to the late payments that they have to take care of, and also they see that they have to apply for loans more, and they see unforeseen increases in borrowing costs. Moving on to the US, in terms of measures, once again, we see legislative measures addressed for government to business payments. There is federal legislation requires to pay subcontractors within 30 days. And similar to Canada, there is the concept of automatic interest payments. So if by due date, the payment is not made, payment request has been made from the contractor, but the payment from the government is not made within due date, automatically interest is accumulated. Also, the legislation foresees the possibility of fast payments within 15 days. This can be set out in the contract. And one very notable example from the US is the payment of subcontractors in construction procurement, where they have to, after the first subcontractor receives the payment, they have to pay their subcontractors within 7 days. And then this moves on to the next tier. So the next subcontractor also has to pay within the same time period. Which is a good way of ensuring that all tiers throughout the whole supply chain payments are made in a timely manner. In terms of the situation in practice, we see that apologies, about half of the invoices are paid late, with only 42% being paid on time and 8% accounting for bad debt. As mentioned, bad debt is when the likelihood of being paid eventually is close to zero. Similar to the previous countries, once again, we observe a domino effect on the supply chain, and companies in these states report that they have delays in paying bills and even their staff at times. An interesting statistic from the states was that 26% of companies in one of the surveys conducted said that they had ceased actually collaboration with a given company due to payment delays. Once again, SMEs are particularly impacted, 73% of them. And we are noticing also a trend of increase in late payments since 2022, over the last few years. Moving on to the UK, here we have quite a lot of measures adopted at national level to address late payments. You can find much more detail about them in the report, but we would like to highlight just a few of them. There is legislation. There are various pieces of legislation in the UK that require large companies to report on their payment practices and performance. This should include also information about their payment practices in annual reports and also average time that they take to pay invoices. In the UK, there is also the recently adopted Fair Payment Code. Before that, the Corporate Payment Code was in force. The Fair Payment Code was adopted in 2024, and it has a rather innovative approach in that it sets out awards, 3 different categories of awards for on-time payers: gold, bronze, and silver. And the goal is to allow also to encourage companies to progress within that from one tier to another. In terms of the situation in practice, we see that the payment times in the UK show a little bit of an improvement over time. With particularly, it's notable that within 31 to 50 days, payers remains the same across the last 2 years, 2023 and 2024. However, still the invoices that were paid late in 2024 were over 50%, 57%. And we see that the average cost for small businesses is about £22,000 yearly, which is approximately 26,000 euros. Very similar to the previous 3 non-EU countries, we see a domino effect on the supply chain when payments are made late. And 32 one interesting statistic from the UK was that 32% of small businesses were in one of the conducted surveys were reporting that they have little to no control over late payments, especially when they are dealing with large customers. 52% of SMEs were paid late in 2022, which covered, in fact, about 2.8 million small firms. And this is particularly notable given that in 2024, over 90%, if I'm not mistaken, 99% of companies in the UK were, in fact, SMEs. So the impact can be rather large. Moving on from the specifics of each countries, we can discuss a little bit what similarities we're noticing between EU approach to combating late payments and the selected non-EU countries. First of all, we see that in terms of approach, both groups of jurisdictions adopt legislative and non-legislative measures, a combination of those, with particularly stronger emphasis on regulating government to business transactions. Another similarity we see is that there is a lack of effective sanctions for breaches of legislative measures, which makes enforcement a serious issue in all jurisdictions. But one thing that is interesting to highlight here is the existence of dedicated authorities in non-EU countries. There is, for instance, in Canada, there is a procurement ombud. In Australia, there is an ombudsman for small and family enterprises. In the UK, there is the Small Business Commission, and in the US, there is the Small Business Administration, which all of them aim to help to monitor payments and particularly help small businesses when trying to when they are dealing with late payments and help them guide through the process. And at times also they provide mediation services, which can help businesses avoid costly judicial procedures. We also see, as you noticed probably in the presentation, that in terms of sector-specific regulation, the construction sector is the most regulated, both for business-to-business and government-to-business transactions. Talking a little bit about differences, while we said that in terms of legislation, they have both groups of jurisdictions have a mixed approach, adopting both legislation and non-legislative measures. We see that the approach in the EU is a bit more interventionist than in the non-EU countries, with the UK being the exception, where, as I said, there are quite a lot of measures adopted. In terms of reporting and transparency in EU, there is not so much focus on that as there is an emphasis on payment terms, whereas in the non-EU country, there is more reliance on reporting mechanisms and transparency. For the payment periods, both EU and non-EU countries deal with the issue of late payments, as you saw from the data, quite significant at times. One particular situation is that in the EU, SMEs seem to face more difficulties compared to, for instance, the US and Canada. And talking about sector-specific regulation, for construction sector, we see that the EU seems to have more demanding, less demanding regulations, perhaps, than non-EU countries that were selected for this study. And in non-EU countries, there are quite strict mandatory payment terms, as you saw, for the construction sector, especially in government to business transactions. So what can we make from this? We can potentially see some good practices here. For instance, regulating conditions for timely payments can help to protect SMEs from late payments, both from government agencies and larger businesses. This is an example we derive from Australia and the US. Mandatory reporting and transparency mechanisms that are quite vast in the non-EU countries can also help to ensure accountability when there is public access to the reports. Supervisory bodies and independent bodies can be helpful. As I mentioned, all of the countries had a specific authority, a specific entity that is dedicated to helping small businesses. So these can help to ensure compliance with reporting obligations, as seen, for instance, in Australia, or handle government contracts and supplier disputes in Canada, and particularly also assist with small companies. Mediation and alternative dispute resolution can be very helpful for small businesses, particularly. And one example here was in Australia that assistance desks were established for late payment claims. And finally, we see also that the promotion of business codes of conduct and industry best practices, albeit voluntary, can also be quite helpful when they are tailored to each sector. And one final mention here when discussing late payments is very important to also mention the issue of competitiveness. As we all know, late payments can lead to poor cash flow. What this means in practice is that it can be an obstacle to the investment potential. It can increase administrative costs for businesses and eventually reduce their market competitiveness. And we already found some data that's saying that companies modify credit strategies so that they can enhance their competitiveness in a market that is becoming more and more challenging. And in this slide, it is also important to note the tariffs that have been imposed by the US and how this can have an impact on cross-border payments between businesses. And of course, once there is an effect on that, this can lead to to a domino effect in payment times. While large businesses arguably can face greater issues, there is still not too much analysis on this, but it is argued the large businesses can be more affected by the tariffs. We should bear in mind that this can contribute once again to the domino effect of late payments. Once a large business is impacted by payment times, then late payments, then this can pass on also to the subcontractors further down the chain. And talking about supply chain, there is research indicating that logistical changes in the supply chain, such as rerouting of trade and payments, can actually result in more complexity and even more delays in the supply of goods and services, and therefore, of course, further delays in payments. And finally, the new tariff charges and supplier price hikes that stem from the transfer of tariff costs can complicate invoices even further. All of this indicates once again that late payments remain a significant challenges for businesses, not only in the EU, but also in the non-EU countries. And disproportionately, this affects SMEs and leads to further cash flow problems for them and further financial instability. While there are differences in the approaches in both legislative and business approaches, the comparative analysis we conducted sees some similarities in the fact that there is a need for strong measures to fight late payments, particularly for SMEs and also in sectors with complex supply chains. And therefore, addressing late payments is essential for a healthy business environment, for good competitiveness, strong competitiveness, and in broader terms, for economic stability. This was our report, which you can find published on the website. The slides will be shared later, so you can have them and you can look at the report, and it's also in the chat, as mentioned previously. Thank you very much. I will stop the sharing now, and we'll pass on the floor back to Antonella.
Thank you very much, Sose, for this very, very interesting presentation. We basically saw that late payment is really a problem globally for all the main economies that trade with the EU. So it's not only EU problem, and these different countries have taken measures to combat the problem, because they realize that this is a problem for the competitiveness of the whole economy and not only of their SMEs. And to discuss and to see more what kind of to dig deeper into the kind of measures that have been adopted and their impact, we have today our distinguished guests. I am here with us is our first guest is Dr. Anthony Flynn. Dr. Anthony Flynn is a senior lecturer in purchasing and supply management of Cardiff University. Welcome, Anthony, for being with us today. And our second speaker is Terry Corby, founder and CEO of Good Business Pays. I am an avid follower of your blog, Terry. Thank you very much for being with us today. And I invite all the present and participants today to really have a look at Terry's blog on LinkedIn, because it's really very, very informative. I will start with Anthony. Thank you very much, Anthony, for being with us today. You have followed very closely the reporting requirements, especially in the UK and in Australia. What are your views of how these reporting requirements have been implemented, the challenges faced by businesses in adhere to these requirements, and the impact that it has had on improving payment practices? So the floor is yours, Anthony. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antonella, and welcome to everyone who's joined the webinar this morning. I've been researching this issue of supplier payment times over the last number of years, starting in the UK, because the UK government in 2018 introduced legislation, or they introduced legislation a couple of years before that, but in 2018, firms had to start disclosing information on their payment performance, and that legislation applies to all large firms with operations in the UK. And subsequently, Australia imposed the same obligation on their large firms, and that started in 2021. So for the first time, researchers have access to data on how long it's taking firms to pay their suppliers. So I think it's a very welcome development. The purpose of the legislation is to bring transparency to this issue of supplier payment times. And the hope of the government and other stakeholders is that by having greater transparency around this issue, it will nudge firms towards acting in a more responsible manner. Because NGOs can look at the data, suppliers can look at the data and even use it in negotiations when they're dealing with these large firms. Investors can look at the data, researchers can look at the data. So in that sense, it is a very welcome development. It was very hard to get your hands on this type of data prior to this legislation coming into force. In terms of implementation, we can see that many firms have complied with their legal obligations. They have submitted the data, and the data is released then by the government into the public domain. Some firms have not complied with the regulations. Some firms may also have not complied every year. They may have complied for the first couple of years and then stopped for whatever reason. But overall, we have a good insight into what firms are doing, and the data tells us that improvements have happened. In the UK, over the last 6-7 years, we can see that there's been a downward trend in the average number of days it's taking large firms to pay their suppliers, and that there's also been a reduction in the percentage of invoices that are deemed non-compliant. So where the firm didn't adhere to the payment terms. So that would suggest that the legislation has had a positive impact on the payment performance of large firms. And that's good for the suppliers, particularly small suppliers, good for the supply chain, and good for the macroeconomy. Of course, the legislation is under review. In both the UK and Australia, they're already making adjustments to the reporting requirements. So they're introducing new questions for firms to answer. They're reviewing the type of data they already have. And it looks as though this is going to remain in place in both countries. And indeed, I think you would expect it, more countries to start adopting it. It's part of, I think, of a wider trend of governments forcing greater transparency in supply chain management generally. Some people may be aware that large firms are also obliged to produce statements on modern slavery risks in their supply chain. The UK government introduced that legislation. Australia has also that legislation, as do many other European countries. So we see governments getting involved in the supply chain, and supplier payment times is sort of the latest iteration of this approach. So yes, a positive development. It is helping to drive change. It's not perfect. It's not a silver bullet, but it has made an improvement.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Just wanted also to tell also to the participants that you're welcome to submit your questions either via the chat. I see that there is also a question. Yes, indeed, we will distribute the slides, and actually they will be made public. And if you want to ask any question during our discussion, please introduce them in the chat or later by raising your hand. Going back to Anthony, thank you very much for this. So on the one side, what I can see is that it's very good. It has been an improvement in the payment performance. So can we say that in a way that companies have in a way embraced this transparency and seeing that is also, how to say, reporting and showing good behavior, it's also good for businesses. So you think that there is, or they're only complying because it's an obligation, we have to do it. But can we say that there is also has triggered a good business behavior, good payment practice, because they see that there is also a return for businesses in behaving well? And my second question is, how do you think it's administratively and burdensome, costly for the companies that have to report to comply with this? Is this a costly exercise in your view? Do you have any data and information that you can share on this point? Thank you.
Okay, so in relation to the first question, it's important to remember that the government doesn't tell firms that this is when you must pay suppliers. All it tells them is this: you must release information about your payment practices and the time it's taking you to pay suppliers. And the logic, of course, is that when firms have the spotlight shone on them, that they will improve their performance, because it's not just current and potential suppliers that can now see how long it takes the firm to pay suppliers. Rival firms can look at each other's performance. So firms in the same industry can see whether they are better or worse than their rivals. And I think that's having an impact. Firms do not want to be seen as an outlier. They do not want to be seen as the bad guy. And that can sort of correct poor payment practice. In relation to the second question about administrative burden, the legislation only applies to large firms. In the UK and Australia, smaller firms can volunteer to supply the information, and many of them are doing so. But legally, it only applies to large firms. The UK government, before introducing the legislation, carried out an impact assessment. So they were thinking about the resource implications for firms. They concluded that it wasn't overly burdensome. Firms have to report twice a year their data in both the UK and Australia. And I think at this point now they should have the systems in place to make it easier. Maybe in the first year or so, there was probably some teething issues. But now that the legislation is bedded in, and it should have become a sort of a standard practice now for firms. They should be comfortable doing it and have the procedures in place that they're able to get this data together and report it, and even maybe incorporate it into their sustainability reports and have it as a KPI. And some firms are quite open about that, not just in terms of submitting the data to the government site, but in having it on their website, having it in their sustainability reports, letting everyone see what their performance are, what their improvement targets are, etc. So they have embraced it in a positive way. Many of the big firms.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Anthony. I see a question here on the chat. Does this reporting differentiate or identify the causes of late payment, whether it's due to it's a function of the economic cycle, or it is an intentional behavior, or it's just a very simple factual statement of when an invoice was paid, or is there an additional information about the causes of why these invoices were paid late?
No, there's really no qualitative information on the causes of late payment. It's just the numeric data.
Thank you very much for this, and please remain with us because there might be other chats and other questions as well from the audience. Terry, welcome. With you, I would like to talk more about, because we heard about some of the actions that have been taken, and the solutions are payment codes. In the UK, there was a long time prompt payment code, and more recently, this payment code has been transformed into a fair payment code with different categories. How do you think that a payment code, in the experience of the previous one, or what could be the experience of the current one, could impact on payment practices? Is it more the reputational damage that is expected that could nudge companies into good payment performance, or there is more, really an embracing that payment on time? It's actually a good how to say, a good business strategy. So tell us a little bit more about the experience of these payment codes in the UK. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for inviting me to the webinar. So the legislative measures, which includes things like codes, whether they be prompt payment or fair payment, are in the UK not a new idea, right? So the way that we at Good Business Pays, we campaign for small businesses to be paid faster, and it's of course usually big businesses that pay slower. That's our job. We've looked at this over a long period of time, and the first legislation that was introduced in the UK, which was the Commercial Payment of Commercial Debts, or Late Payment of Commercial Debts Act, was in 1998, 17 years ago, which allowed small businesses to automatically charge interest on invoices that were paid late. So for 17, 18 years, various governments have tried to introduce different bits of legislation in order to change company behavior. That has included, of course, as things as like Anthony has mentioned, being transparent about how long it takes you to pay. And that alone was a good thing, but didn't change behavior radically. Then onwards, introducing a prompt payment code, which was a promise to pay faster, a popular thing, very popular with smaller businesses. Some bigger businesses signed up, but remember, it's only a promise, not a lived behavior. And more recently, and the prompt payment code was about speed of payment, right? It was, we will promise to pay in 30 days. It was recognized about a year or two ago that payment behavior is part of a broader relationship between a company and its supplier, and that fair contracting should be in there as well. So contracting terms, not just speed. And so that was developed into the Fair Payment Code, which goes beyond just the speed of payment into the relationship between large and small. It was introduced back in November. It's still too early to say whether it will be a success or not, because it's more complicated to administer and to apply for, both for the big company and for the team that does it. But the principles behind it are very, very good. The one thing that I would say is that all of these things that's to do with government legislation, codes, small business commissioners, who are the people that's supposed to police this stuff, only goes part of the way towards behavior change. Now, Anthony mentioned that when the measures were put in place, you could see how your competitors were doing, right? And I would argue, having looked at this for quite a long time, that you get more behavior change when a company sees their competitor is doing better than them than by a government telling them how to behave. So even if you take, for example, the compliance issue, right? How many companies actually comply with sending in their figures in the first place? In 2017, when this regulation was introduced, there was roughly, according to EY and DBT, around 10,000 companies in the UK that would need to comply. And if you're interested in compliance and the government compliance program, Good Business Pays released a webinar just this morning on our channel telling you about the latest enforcement program of this regulation. Because what we find now is that the government still think between 10 and 15,000 should be reporting, but I have to tell you only 5,500 are. So there are literally thousands of companies that still don't report. And finally, I would say that, we have done a lot and payment times have improved in the UK, but not according to the slide that you showed in the thematic report, which still says 57% of small businesses are being paid late in the UK. So we've got a long way to go, Anthony.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I am very impressed for the performance indicators that are in the new Fair Payment Code. So in the categories gold, silver, and bronze, where there are very specific payment terms. I think you are gold if you commit to pay 90% of your invoices in 30 days. Bronze if you pay the 90% in 60 days, and so on. So they are very specific payment terms. And what really it's interesting for us in the debate here in Europe is that there is no difference according to sector. According to whether are sectors that might have longer conversion cost cycles. Was this a problem, and then was then discussed? How did the UK arrive to these 60 days or 30 days, regardless of any sector?
Well, it is true that some sectors are worse than others in terms of payment practices. And there are some sectors that grumble that, well, it's difficult for us to pay fast because whatever the reason happens to be. We would argue that in every company, in every sector, you pay your employees at the end of the month. You don't say to them, we'll pay you in 90 days in pharmaceutical sector just because you pay late, for example. Now, there was a very big consultation with every sector and every sector industry before the Fair Payment Code and what have you was introduced. Everybody had a say in what they thought was right and good. Now, here's the good news is that over the past few years, we've seen big businesses in every sector nodding their heads saying, yes, we think that paying small businesses is an important thing to do, and we'd like to do it, right? What is more difficult is very often their systems are not geared up to be able to just do that. And this can relate to, you mentioned the different categories of gold and silver and bronze. So for gold, yes, you have to pay sort of 95% of all businesses, all invoices in 30 days. To get the silver award, it's 95% of small businesses you have to pay in 30 days.
Okay.
But if you've got a big system from Cooper, Ariba, SAP, and all of these big company systems, you can't necessarily press a button and it spit out a report to say every invoice you paid in a certain amount of time to a certain size of company over the past year. So where there's a bit of a struggle is the questions that we're asking companies to prove in order to get the award can prove tricky to get out of their company systems. So there's a will there from the big companies. It's more the way, which is does the technology support you to be able to do that?
Thank you very much for this information. The role of technology, do you think that e-invoicing can be a kind of game changer? A question to both of you, to Anthony and Terry. Do you think that e-invoicing can be a game changer in improving payment behavior? What's both your take of both of you? Thank you. Anthony, please.
Okay, well, I can tell you from the research that I did that approximately 20% of the UK firms that had submitted data stated that they had an e-invoicing system in place. But those firms that did have an e-invoicing system in place didn't have any better payment performance. So they weren't more likely to pay suppliers promptly. They didn't have better rates of compliance. The e-invoicing system of itself wasn't associated with better payment performance. And I think it simply comes down to the fact that it's a managerial decision on when to release money to your suppliers. There's nothing wrong with the invoicing system. We know what it can do in terms of streamlining the payment process, that it can take human error out of the process. It can deal with all the issues that can result in payment delays, but ultimately it's for the managers to decide when the suppliers get paid. And based on my analysis, having the invoicing system doesn't mean that the supplier is going to be paid faster.
Yeah, I would agree with Anthony. I think it can beautifully actually provide you with reports, fast payment, all the way through the tiers in a big construction program. It can do that. But when I ask the question of the e-invoicing experts, which is, does there still need to be a human in the process to sign off that this can be paid? And the answer is yes. As soon as you introduce the human, you introduce material and cultural issues. And in some companies, I know as they get towards the end of the financial year, they will say, don't answer the phone from suppliers. We need to hold on to the cash, right? So if you have a cultural managerial decision that says we're not going to pay suppliers for 2 weeks, doesn't matter whether you have e-invoicing or anything else, it doesn't happen. But it can happen and it can help.
So there is still a way to go to increase the payment culture, basically. Thank you very much to both. I have another question on digital and on innovative solutions. Do you think that, it's here in the chat, do you think that central bank digital currencies will help the late payment problem, both with transparency and consequences for late payments? Whoever wants to take the question.
That one, but
Any ideas on this? Terry, Anthony?
From my perspective, it's always going to be a human decision, right? The answer is yes. Any of these things can help. When we, particularly I spend a lot of time talking to very big businesses, and what I found is that the decision as to how fast you pay your small businesses, your suppliers, in fact, is always the decision of the chief financial officer, and sometimes in conjunction with the CEO. So it's a very small number of people that make a policy decision on behalf of a very large organization, right? So for example, and I've used this example before, we published the list of companies that pay slowly. Coca-Cola was a company that was in that, paying at roughly 129 days. That was published in Fortune magazine in the US, and the CFO came out and said, we are changing our policy to pay small businesses, wait for it, in Great Britain in 30 days, because we'd applied some pressure around that issue. So when a human inside a company can make a decision that affects thousands or hundreds of thousands of business and people, yes, the currency can help. Yes, cards can help and e-invoicing can help. But they are just things to facilitate a managerial decision.
Anthony, you want to add?
I don't have anything specific to say about central bank digital currencies, just not something that I know about in relation to supplier payments. One thing that we haven't mentioned, though, is supply chain finance and how it might be able to help square the circle on this issue. And the UK reporting system does ask all the firms if they're using supply chain finance. Approximately 8-9% say they are. So I think that's one way to achieve a win-win, where the supplier will be able to receive the funds promptly, sometimes within 7-14 days, and the buying firm doesn't have to settle with the funds provider, the bank or whoever, for 60 days or 90 days. So I think that's something that we might see expanding, or the use of it might expand over the coming years.
I think I'll just jump in. And the only thing I would say about supply chain finance is if there is a charge to a small business using that service, it feels like they're just having to pay to get paid. And big firms like Carillion abused that system many years ago and left a lot of small firms going bust. So supply chain finance is there, it's a good thing. But if it costs small businesses money only to get paid, it just feels like they're providing a bank service to the bigger ones.
Thank you. Thank you for this. I have here other questions. The role of mediation, alternative dispute resolution, and then also the role of supervisory bodies, independent bodies. How you both see their in your experience? Maybe in the UK, the role of the Small Business Commissioner. I don't know whether in Australia there is something similar. If you can expand on this, were two questions on this in the chat. Anthony, please.
Okay, well, I just focus on one, which is the adjudicator, the regulator for the groceries and retail sector in the UK, and it's currently investigating Amazon over allegations of late payments and sort of abuses of suppliers. It does have powers to investigate, and I think to impose fines. So it does have some teeth. It's just for the retail sector, but it has investigated other big retailers in the past also.
And do you think that it has an impact? At least there is in the decisions of the adjudicator. Do you think it has an impact? Because the problem for small SMEs or those who are in a weaker position is very difficult to initiate any form of redress. So having a third party removes this kind of fear. There is the fear of retaliation, or really fear of losing the market, the business relation, and having fear of not having any more contracts anymore. So do you think that having a third party helps in this sense?
Absolutely, because it's essentially the industry regulator. So it's looking at the big players in the industry and how their practices affect hundreds or thousands of suppliers. So it's in effect acting on behalf of all of these small suppliers.
Yeah, I would just totally agree with all of that. We've been asked to mediate before between small and very large contractors, and what I've found is that you need some diplomacy to do that properly, but you need a firmness and a fairness. And when you get to the right person inside a big company, particularly as, I would talk to the CEO and say, do you realize this is going on? Normally the CEO is so far away from the engine room of the accounting department, they're not aware that their business might be causing harm, and they don't have that intention at all, especially towards smaller suppliers. If you can fix that bit through a conversation, all the better.
Thank you very much for this both testimony. Overall, you think in order to improve payment performance, payment culture, payment behavior, it's more rather the stick or the carrot? The stick meaning, because there was also question more the role of supervisory bodies with sanctions, or having carrots, I don't know, like including name and fame, kind of prices. What's your view on this? Anthony, please.
Okay, well, one example of the stick and carrot approach that the government is taking is that they're using big contractors' payment performance when deciding on eligibility to bid for government contracts. So you can see how that could potentially affect the behavior of these big contractors. They may be disqualified from competing for business with the government if they're not paying their suppliers in their private sector supply chains in a reasonable amount of time. So that's one lever that the government has used to try and coax them into more responsible payment practice.
Yeah, and I would say stick works in the short term, in terms of short-term behavior. Please get your report in on time. But if you want to change behavior over a long period of time, you need the carrot. This is a lot more like things to do with climate change and sustainability, right? If you look at trying to get companies to think about sustainability, ESG, climate change stuff, they have to find the business reason for doing that, not just because it's a nice thing to do. And if they can find the good business reason, which is why we call this thing Good Business Pays, not Nice People Pays, if they can find the good business reason for doing it, it will become part of their change program and they will own it.
Thank you very much for this. We are getting at the end of our webinar. Very interesting chat. I mean, I would continue more, but I'd like to thank Anthony and Terry for your very valuable insights. I'd like to thank Sose for the presentation. And of course, I'd like to thank all the participants for having been with us today. If you have any other questions, please get in touch with us. And I recall that the report is already made public. The presentation will be made public as well, and also this recording will be made public. So if you want to go back to our discussion today, so thank you very much to all, and I wish you a very nice day and a very nice summer. Thank you. Bye.